Hello, everyone. Welcome to Financial Planning Academy 2025. What I'd like to go over now is a little bit of training over this year's case study. So we're going to look at three different things in this training. We're going to look at the case study document itself. We're going to look at the case study solutions. And then we're also going to look at the financial calculators that we use to support our analysis through the assignments that we do related to the case study. So let's jump in by looking at the actual case study itself. So in this year's case study, we're going to be working with Mark and Cami Heileman. Now, I'm not going to go through and read all of this to you. I'm going to more talk about how this is laid out. I'm going to look at the assignments and the solution with you and really give you a good feel of what our objective is when working through the case study and hopefully point you in the direction of where you can find answers in relation to the different topics and assignments that we cover during Financial Planning Academy. So this first page in the case study document is really information about Mark and Cami. So it tells us a little bit about their demographic information, where they live, where they work, a little bit about their personal situations, their habits, their preferences. It also tells us some things about their financial situation. So you can see here a little bit about their home, a little bit about their employee benefits, and even some introduction into some of their goals. So once we get through this introductory information about our clients, the next page in the case study is just a little bit more of a formal summary of some of this stuff. So the first thing is just, again, a little bit more about Mark and Cami, when they were born, where they got their educations, and where they work. Once we get to page 3, now we're starting to look at some of the balance sheet information. So we have information about their assets, cash equivalents, a little bit about their automobiles, and personal property. So the next page goes over their liabilities. Now, in this liability section, you'll notice for each of their liabilities, we have their balance, their interest rate, the current amount outstanding on those debts, the payments that they make towards those debts, and when they started making those payments. And that's true for home and autos, student loans, and credit cards. Once we get to the next page, we move on to the income and expense statement. This is going to be a really nice summary of all of their cash flow activity over the course of the last year. So the first thing that we see is their incomes, right? Mark's salary, Cami's salary, and a little bit of interest that they've earned. And then we also see their expenses. This is broken down both on a monthly and annual cash flow basis and separated out between fixed expenses and variable expenses. One of the things that you'll notice is that we have totals, both for monthly income and annual income, as well as monthly expenses and annual expenses. And so one of the things that I'll point out to you right off the bat is that Mark and Cami are working with about a $12,000 surplus over the course of the year. So they do have some money that's going to be available to address some of their goals. But as with any, or I shouldn't say any, but with most financial planning clients, their goals are going to be a little bit more expensive than the cash they have available. And so we're really going to have to think about what trade-offs do we want to make and how do we want to prioritize their cash flows to put them in the best position to maintain a lifestyle that suits their preferences, but also allows them to make progress towards the things that they really value as they move forward. Okay, now I really like this page in the case study document. This is really helpful for the students that will be on your teams as they work through the assignments and process trade-offs in the context of how much the different things are going to cost, right? So on the previous page, right, we have their current income and expenses, but these are the new things that they want to bring on in relation to their goals, right? They want to establish some emergency savings. They're thinking about potentially buying a new home. They want to make sure that they have money available for vacations. They want to start saving for their retirement. They want to make sure that they're making good health insurance decisions. and are adequately covered for life insurance, disability insurance, and then potentially even some things related to a new boat. All right, so this is just a really good place again for students to stay organized with regards to how much these things are going to cost. If they can kind of document um, what these things are going to cost, they can come back and compare the cost of the new items that are going to be on their budget moving forward with their previous spending habits. And again, what we're going to see is that these things are going to probably be a little bit more expensive than what they have left over at the end of the year. And so we're going to have to balance making progress towards the things that they want to accomplish and also, again, maintaining their lifestyle at a satisfactory level. I would highly encourage you to have your students put this into an Excel document from the very beginning, along with potentially this income and expense statement. And then that way, they have information in a place where they can kind of plug and play, switch things in and out of that income and expense statement and see how either the addition or removal of certain expenses impacts their total cash flow picture. All right. Then moving on, we learn a little bit more about their insurance. They don't have any life insurance right now, but they do have some insurance available to them. They also don't have any disability insurance, but they do have that available through some employee benefits. And then they currently have medical insurance, but with Cami starting a new job, they really want to evaluate which of the two plans they should be taking advantage of, right? Currently, they're under Mark's plan, but they're wondering if it would be more advantageous to switch over to Cami's plan. And there's a nice document that I'll share with you guys that does a really simple analysis of the two plans, compares them against one another, and helps you view the cost of the plans in terms of total cost for different levels of expected healthcare expenses. And ultimately, what we want to do is we want to choose the plan that provides the most efficient coverage for the level of healthcare expense that we think the clients may incur over the course of the next year. And then we also want to take a look at some estate planning information. Right now, they don't have any estate planning documents in place, and we're going to be making some recommendations about getting some basic estate planning documents in place for the client. Here we learn a little bit more about their financial goals, and then also their priorities and how the priorities vary between Mark and Cami in their household. We see quite a bit of consistency between the two, and so they're not wildly different on really anything other than starting a family, right? Cami is prioritizing this pretty highly, as to where Mark doesn't seem to have a preference to start a family right off the bat. And so just making sure we kind of understand where both of our clients are in relation to their financial priorities is always important. Then we just have some other information on preferences. And this will give some insight into how we can balance trade-offs when making recommendations to address both of the client's needs, both of the client's wants, and really put together a plan that will be satisfactory to the couple as a whole. All right, once we get through the information portion of the set of the case study, the next set of pages that we're going to see are the assignments that the students are going to complete over the course of Financial Planning Academy. And so the way that we'll do this is we will introduce content through a short lecture video. And so in your schedules, you'll see that we have, for the sake of this example, a cash and management section in the schedule during the week. And so when we get to that cash and debt management section, we'll watch a short video over the topic. And then after that video, the students will go in and they'll start working through these assignments. And they're going to use the financial calculators through dinkytown.net, which I'll show you here in just a little bit, to help solve these problems. But ultimately, what they're going to have by the time they go through these assignments is they're going to have a full set of analysis that helps them understand the cost of the goals that they brought to the table, or I shouldn't say help the client understand, but helps you as the planner and your team as the planners understand how much the things the client wants to do are going to cost. Okay. And then once we have that information, again, we can start to manipulate that to address their goals as efficiently as possible based on the resources that they have available to do so. Okay, so with cash and debt management, our first assignment is 4 questions. With each question, they'll perform some calculations, and then I'll ask some thinking questions, right? Like, are there any areas of spending where you think they might be able to trim some expenses? That's a good question, number 1. What I would encourage you to do with your students is have them take good notes, because ultimately what we want them to do as they approach the end of the assignments is to be able to go back in and see documentation of the thoughts that they had as they went through the process. And what that ends up doing is it makes the creation of the final plan a lot more efficient because they don't have to rethink through everything at the end of the analysis process, or at least not as much as they would have to if they don't do a good job documenting their thoughts. Okay, so in the number 2, right, suggest how they might be able to adjust spending to reach this goal that we're analyzing. With question 3, can Mark and Cami afford to buy a boat? If not, explain what they might have to sacrifice to be able to afford that boat. So all of these assignments will have the analysis portion and then some evaluation and thought that goes into really understanding what they're looking at in terms of the analysis that they performed and how it relates to their plan as a whole. The cash and debt management section is the only one that has 2 assignments. The second assignment related to cash and debt management is more related to their goal of potentially buying a new home. And so we'll go through the process of performing that analysis to see how feasible that is for Mark and Cami. Okay, and then we have the additional sections to the plan, right? We have investments. In the investment section, we really want them to understand how fees impact performance over time. A lot of times it's really easy for clients to get focused on returns, but we want to help them understand that it's a combination, right? We have to understand performance, but we also have to understand cost and how the two impact one another with regards to the efficiency of portfolio returns over time. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you right now that the purpose of this assignment is to be illustrative, right? I'm not suggesting that Mark and Cami should invest $250 per month for 40 years. All I'm wanting the students to do here is go in and perform the analysis based on the criteria that we've set up in this assignment so that they can see the impact of the different portfolio alternatives that we've presented. Okay, now they will need to select one of these portfolios, okay? And so they either need to select the portfolio that returns 10.3% per year with a 2% management fee, or one of the other alternatives that we've suggested here. And my recommendation obviously is going to be to choose the one that yields the greatest benefit over time, net of fees. And then we'll move on and look at retirement. Okay. And so we learn a little bit more just kind of about their retirement plans, what they're hoping to accomplish to hit their retirement goals, and what it might cost to be able to accomplish those objectives. Okay, so we'll run some calculations related to that. We'll also look at some trade-offs, right? If Mark and Cami feel like they need to delay retirement planning to have more cash flow available today to fund other goals, how does that change the amount that they need to save from delaying, and so on and so forth? And so we want to understand, again, the trade-offs of how we use our cash today and the impacts of how we use our cash today with regards to our ability to fund longer term goals. We'll look at some insurance and estate stuff. So we'll just help them understand where should we really be looking at having insurance. We always want to have insurance for those things that are low probability, high cost. And so we want them to identify things that fall into this quadrant, right? And recognize that those are the best places to be allocating our insurance dollars. Spoiler alert, we all know that disability insurance is something they need to have, especially without good emergency savings. Life insurance is something they need to have. And then health insurance is something they need to have. And so we just want them to really understand the concept of why insuring in these areas is very important, so that when we make a recommendation to allocate a portion of their resources to these things, they know that it's producing a benefit, even though it might not be the most fun way to spend their money. And then we'll do that insurance analysis and recommend some basic estate planning documents. Again, we'll have a lecture over each of these topics. We'll go into assignments. The students will document their analysis and their thoughts in relation to that analysis. And all of that will build into what they need at the end of the day to be able to produce recommendations in a final plan for their client. So what is your role in this process? I'll start by telling you what your role is not, right? Your role is not to tell the students what the answers are, right? Your goal is to listen and observe and really serve as the bumpers in the bowling lane, right? We don't want them going in the gutter and chasing wild ideas or things that aren't feasible, or pursuing trains of thought that are inaccurate. And so we want to be able to answer questions for them. We want to be able to provide guidance, but it's not your job to provide answers. Okay, so now that we've been through the document and we understand what our role is, let's take a look at the solution really quickly. So you'll see here that in your solution, I've basically taken those assignments and I've chopped them up on a per question basis. So here's question number 1 for the first assignment. Go to dinkytown.net and follow these instructions. And I was pretty detailed in the instructions, right? So go to the home budget analysis calculator in the personal finance category and enter the income and expenses that I showed you in the case study document. And so I'll just kind of give you an example for this question of how this works. So going to Dinkytown, this is what it looks like. And so we can come over here to calculators and we can look at our personal finance calculators. And here's the home budget analysis that we want to calculate. Now I've already input the numbers from the case study in here. I'll go ahead and tell you right now, the way that Dinkytown is laid out, there's not going to be a perfect fit for every expense item that you see on that income and expense statement that I provided for you. And so what I would tell students is just make sure that they get all of the expenses in and put those expenses in the best fit calculators possible. Okay, and then once they do that, what's really cool about dinkytown.net is we can view a report. Now, this is really awesome because these will be great graphics for the case study presentation that the teams are going to be making on the last day of Financial Planning Academy. And so if you want to, you can print this, and I would print this to a PDF, right? And then that way with these PDFs, you can go in and you can take screenshots of the different graphics, and then you can just drop those graphics right into that PowerPoint presentation that the students are going to be creating. And so it's going to provide really nice graphics and really nice summarized information of the analysis that they're going to be performing over the course of the case study. Okay, so we can just close that out. I can hide the report, and it takes me back to my analysis here. All right, so this is really cool. These calculators are super intuitive and easy to use. So I'm going to go back to the case study document or the solutions document, right? And what I provided you is I provided you with that PDF so that you can have it in your files, right? So if students are like, is this right? You can go back and you can look at the actual solutions that's been produced in relation to each question, right? So here's all of that printout for question number one. And then we get into question number two, right? And then question number two, I provided you with all of the information that you need to be able to answer the questions. Did I get this correct? Now, what I would highly recommend that you do is I would recommend that you go through each one of these questions yourself as part of your training to input and work with Dinkytown so that when students ask a question about how to do something inside this calculator, you've done it already and you're going to be much more efficient in helping them out. It'll give you so much more confidence and familiarity, and you'll be able to be a much better resource for your students at the end of the day. In addition to being a much better resource for your students by going through that process, it'll also help you identify questions that you have so that when we meet for our face-to-face training sessions, you can ask those questions that you have and you can get clarification on anything that's tripping you up before the week starts. Again, I think if you'll do this, although it'll take a little bit of time, my guess is somewhere in the ballpark of an hour or so, you'll be much better equipped, much more confident, and it'll really help you focus on the things that are the most fun parts of your job. And that is engaging the students, building relationships with those students, sharing your experiences with those students, and really becoming a mentor and a leader for them that impacts their experience in a really meaningful way. Just so much less stress and a really, really important part of your training by the time it's all said and done. All right, so I'm not going to go through this entire document. I just really want you to see how it's laid out, what's included, and again, express the importance of going through and answering these questions on your own, reproducing what you have here, and then when the students need help, you know exactly how to help, and you know exactly where to go in the resources that you've been given to provide guidance and clarity so that the students can learn as quickly as possible and ultimately be as successful as possible through their experience over the course of the week. Hey guys, I know that's a quick training. You've got some homework now. I really look forward to coming together on campus and finalizing any last questions that you have in relation to the case study and making sure that you're equipped to have a great week at Financial Planning Academy. Thank you in advance for being such an important part of our team. I can't wait to work with each and every one of you. And if you have any questions between now and the time that we do meet, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to help in any way that I possibly can. And again, just look forward to working with you guys this summer.